Welcome to Sleepscape. If you enjoyed this, you can like the video and subscribe for more. If there's a story that you'd like for me to tell, feel free to leave a comment. It helps more than you know. Now, let's get into it. The events connected to the Black Hope horror took place in the Newport subdivision of Crosby, Texas, northeast of Houston. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, families moved into the neighborhood believing they had found quiet suburban homes where they could settle down and raise their children. For Sam and Judith Haney, it felt like the home they had always wanted. For Ben and Jean Williams, it seemed like a peaceful place to start over. But underneath part of the neighborhood, there was something many of the residents didn't know existed. A forgotten cemetery. And according to several of the families who lived there, disturbing things began happening after graves beneath the neighborhood were uncovered. The story would eventually become one of the most well-known paranormal cases ever featured on the television series Unsolved Mysteries. Tonight, we're taking a closer look at the case now known as the Black Hope Horror. By 1982, Sam and Judith Haney had settled comfortably into their home in Newport. Like many homeowners, they eventually decided they wanted to install a swimming pool in the backyard. But before excavation began, something strange happened. According to Sam Haney, an elderly man approached him after noticing preparations for the pool. The man warned Sam not to dig in the yard. Sam later recalled following the man into the backyard where he pointed towards specific areas on the ground and claimed there were graves buried there. At first, Sam didn't know how to react. There were no visible headstones, no cemetery markers, nothing suggesting human remains were buried beneath the property. Still, the warning stayed in the back of his mind. Eventually, Sam decided to see if the man's claims were true. Using a backhoe, he began digging in the backyard. It wasn't long before he hit something beneath the soil. Sam stopped using the machinery and climbed into the excavation site to continue digging by hand. There, beneath compressed pine boards, he discovered what appeared to be the outline of a human skeleton. It quickly became clear that the remains were real. Authorities were immediately contacted. The sheriff's department and county coroner arrived at the Haney property and began an official exhumation. As investigators continued digging, more remains were uncovered. According to reports, many of the bones had become extremely brittle over time. Some reportedly disintegrated when touched. Then, investigators made another disturbing discovery. Inside a second coffin, 2 wedding rings were found on the exposed index finger of one of the skeletons. Judith Haney later described the moment as deeply upsetting. She said it sickened her to think they had accidentally desecrated someone's grave. Wanting to understand what had happened, the Haneys began researching the history of the land beneath their home. Their search eventually led them to a longtime local resident named Jasper Norton. According to Norton, portions of the Newport subdivision had been built on top of an old African American cemetery known as Black Hope Cemetery. Many of the people buried there were former slaves and sharecroppers. The final burial reportedly took place in 1939. Over time, the cemetery had fallen into neglect and much of its history faded from public memory. According to Norton, As many as 60 people may have been buried there in paupers' graves. The remains discovered in the Haney's backyard were later identified as Betty and Charlie Thomas. The couple had died decades earlier during the 1930s. The Haneys ultimately made the decision to rebury Betty and Charlie in their backyard and hoped their spirits would finally be at peace. But according to Judith Haney, that was when strange things inside the home began. According to Judith Haney, one of the first disturbing incidents involved a clock inside the bedroom. One night, the clock suddenly began sparking and emitting a strange blue glow. When Judith checked the clock, she discovered it wasn't plugged in. She later described this as one of the moments that genuinely frightened her. Then came another incident. One evening, Sam was working the night shift while Judith remained home alone. At some point during the night, Judith heard the sliding glass door open. Then she heard what sounded like Sam's voice, saying, "What you doing?" Believing her husband had returned home unexpectedly, Judith went to investigate. But when she checked the house, the sliding glass door was still locked. No one was there. The next morning, another strange event occurred. Judith was getting ready for work when she realized her red shoes had disappeared. She and Sam searched throughout the house but couldn't find them anywhere. Eventually, they walked outside near the graves in the backyard. There, resting side by side on top of the gravesite, were Judith's shoes. Then Sam realized something even stranger. The date happened to be Betty Thomas's birthday. Sam later said it almost felt as though Charlie Thomas had brought his wife a birthday present. As time passed, the Haneys reported additional disturbances. According to Judith, unexplained sounds moved through the house during the night. The atmosphere inside the home slowly changed. Judith later described constantly feeling frightened inside her own house. She said she cried often and became afraid of simply going through her normal daily routine. The Haneys also discovered they were not alone. According to reports, multiple neighbors in the subdivision began reporting strange experiences of their own. Some described lights turning on and off by themselves. Others reported unexplained sounds, water faucets activating unexpectedly, and shadow-like apparitions. For many of the families living there, the neighborhood no longer felt normal. Like the Haneys, Ben and Jean Williams originally believed they had found their ideal suburban home. But according to Jean, she never truly felt comfortable there. She later described having a constant sense that something wasn't right on the property. Even simple things became unusual. Jean said plants refused to grow no matter what she tried. Then the family noticed strange sinkholes forming near a flower bed outside the house. According to the Williams family, the depressions resembled the unmistakable shape of coffins. The holes were repeatedly filled in. But according to the family, they kept returning. The Williamses also began noticing strange markings carved into nearby trees. A longtime resident later explained that the markings had been used years earlier to remember where relatives were buried. The realization deeply disturbed the family. According to the Williamses, paranormal activity inside the home gradually intensified afterward. They reported seeing shadowy figures moving along walls, whispering sounds, and a foul odor that sometimes accompanied the experiences. One afternoon, Jean Williams and her granddaughter went to lie down for a nap. The house was quiet, Then they heard the front door open. A moment later, footsteps began moving through the house. Slowly, room by room, then closer to the bedroom. Believing someone had entered the home, Jean grabbed her revolver. She and her granddaughter searched the house carefully, but every door remained locked. No windows had been opened, and there was no sign anyone had entered the home at all. At the time, Ben and Jean's granddaughter Carly was also living in the home. Carly later described suddenly walking into pockets of freezing cold air during the middle of the summer. She said the atmosphere inside the house constantly felt wrong, as though someone unseen was watching. According to Carly, toilets inside the home would flush on their own. And during those moments, she claimed she could hear what sounded like murmuring voices or conversations within the flowing water. Jean Williams became convinced the activity was connected to the graves beneath the property. She later stated that she believed the family was being tormented because they were living on top of a cemetery. Ben and Jean discussed leaving the home, but financially, they felt trapped. According to Ben, they decided they would stay and try to fight through whatever was happening. Then one night, Ben claimed he experienced something he could never explain. After returning home from work shortly after midnight, Ben walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. That was when he allegedly saw two ghostly figures standing nearby. According to Ben, the figures moved backward through the den and then down the hallway toward the bedroom where Jean was sleeping. Ben followed them, but by the time he reached the room, only one figure remained. He later said the figure appeared to be standing near the bed. Acting on instinct, Ben lunged toward it. But the moment he made contact, the figure disappeared. Ben later described feeling a sticky cold sensation pass through his body. According to the Williams family, several immediate family members were later diagnosed with cancer. 3 eventually died from the disease. The family became convinced the property itself was somehow connected to the tragedies surrounding them. As conditions inside the neighborhood continued deteriorating, the Haneys decided to pursue legal action against the developers responsible for the subdivision. The family argued they had unknowingly purchased property built atop cemetery land and believed the developers should have disclosed that information. The case eventually went to trial. The developers denied intentionally withholding information and claimed they had been unaware of the cemetery. In 1987, the jury concluded they did not believe the developers intentionally harmed the Haneys. However, the jury also recommended that the Haneys receive compensation for mental anguish. The Haneys were initially awarded $142,000. But the legal victory did not last. The ruling was eventually overturned. The Haneys appealed multiple times, including bringing the matter before the Supreme Court of Texas. Ultimately, no successful rehearing occurred. The legal battle devastated the family financially. According to Sam Haney, the ordeal eventually resulted in bankruptcy, the loss of their money, and the loss of their home. The Williams family also explored legal options. But according to Jean and Ben Williams, they were told that without definitive proof of graves beneath their property, there was little they could do. Frustrated and desperate, Jean decided to begin digging herself. She reportedly believed that if bodies were found on the property, it would finally prove what the family had been saying all along. But shortly after beginning the excavation, Jean became ill. Her adult daughter, Tina, volunteered to continue digging. According to witnesses present that day, Tina worked for roughly half an hour before suddenly becoming dizzy and weak. She eventually went back inside the house and lay down on the couch. Carly later recalled Tina repeatedly saying she didn't feel right. Then Tina reportedly looked at her mother and said, quote, "Mommy, take care of my baby," unquote. While finally waiting for paramedics to arrive, Jean attempted to keep her daughter conscious. But Tina had suffered a massive heart attack. 2 days later, she died. She was 30 years old. For Jean Williams, the loss was devastating. Jean later became convinced that disturbing another grave had somehow brought tragedy upon the family. Eventually, the Williams family left the neighborhood entirely. They later relocated to Montana before eventually returning to Texas. According to the family, they no longer experienced paranormal disturbances after leaving Black Hope behind. The Black Hope case eventually gained national attention. Ben and Jean Williams later worked with author John Bruce Shoemaker to write a book documenting their experiences titled The Black Hope Horror. According to Shoemaker, the writing process lasted approximately 3.5 years. The book was published in 1991. In 1992, the story was adapted into a made-for-television film titled Grave Secrets: The Legacy of Hilltop Drive. Public reaction to the case has remained deeply divided. Some people view Black Hope as one of the most disturbing alleged hauntings connected to suburban America. Others believe the events were caused by stress, fear, grief, coincidence, suggestion, or misinterpretation. Years later, several newer residents living in the neighborhood reported experiencing nothing unusual at all. To this day, no definitive explanation has ever been found for what the Haneys and Williams families claim to experience. Whether paranormal or psychological, the events connected to Black Hope permanently changed the lives of the families involved. And decades later, the story still remains one of the most unsettling alleged haunting cases ever connected to a quiet American suburb. If you enjoyed tonight's story, subscribe to Sleepscape for more true paranormal encounters, mysteries, and disturbing cases from around the world. If you enjoyed this, you can like the video and subscribe for more. Feel free to leave a comment. It helps more than you know. In the winter of the early 1980s, Janet Smurl was alone in the basement of her family's duplex on Chase Street in West Pittston when she heard someone softly call her name.
Janet.
At first, she ignored it. The washing machine had already begun its cycle, filling the basement with that low mechanical rhythm that old houses seem to absorb into their walls. Upstairs, the television played faintly, somewhere in the distance. The rest of the home was empty. Her husband Jack was at work. The children were at school. The house should have been silent. Then the voice came again.
Janet.
This time it was clearer, closer. Janet slowly turned away from the washing machine and stared into the unfinished darkness of the basement. Cardboard boxes sat stacked against the concrete walls. Christmas decorations rested beneath dusty shelves. Weak daylight filtered through the small basement window near the ceiling, illuminating only pieces of the room while leaving the corners swallowed in shadow. There was nobody there. Janet later claimed the voice did not sound distorted or monstrous. If anything, that was what frightened her most. It sounded ordinary. Human. Like someone casually trying to get her attention from another room. She searched the basement anyway. Nothing. Then, just as she reached the staircase, the voice called her name again.
Janet.
This time directly behind her. According to Janet, something about the tone had changed. The voice no longer sounded curious. Now it sounded amused, almost playful. As though whatever was speaking understood she was afraid. Janet later claimed she shouted back into the basement in terror. "What do you want?" The voice never answered. It only whispered her name again.
Janet.
Years later, the Smurl family would say this moment marked a turning point inside the house on Chase Street. Because until then, strange things had happened around the property, but after the voices began, the family no longer believed they were dealing with random noises. They believed something inside the house was listening to them, learning them. And according to the Smurls, over time, the thing inside the home became disturbingly good at sounding human. The Smurl haunting would eventually become one of the most infamous paranormal cases in American history. The case attracted national media attention throughout the 1980s. Paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren became heavily involved. Priests reportedly blessed the property multiple times. Skeptics accused the family of exaggeration and mass hysteria. Television crews crowded the street outside the home while reporters documented nearly every new claim emerging from the duplex. But before any of that happened, the Smurls were simply a working-class Pennsylvania family trying to recover from disaster. In 1972, Hurricane Agnes devastated parts of northeastern Pennsylvania. Entire neighborhoods flooded beneath rising water, including the home shared by Jack Smurl's parents, John and Mary Smurl. The family suddenly found themselves displaced. Eventually, John and Mary purchased a duplex on Chase Street in West Pittston. Jack and Janet moved into one side with their children while John and Mary occupied the other. The duplex was old, repairs were constant. The home creaked in the winter and groaned during storms. Like many homes throughout the region, it sat above old mining tunnels that had long since flooded and collapsed beneath the earth. People in West Pittston were used to strange sounds, settling foundations, shifting pipes, banging walls. Everything had an explanation, at least at first. According to the family, the strange activity began gradually after they moved into the duplex during the early 1970s. A dark stain repeatedly appeared on a carpet no matter how many times it was cleaned. Freshly repaired pipes burst unexpectedly. Tools vanished during renovations and later reappeared in impossible places. Then came electrical problems. One evening, Jack reportedly watched his television burst into flames without warning. Other appliances overheated or smoked for no clear reason. Still, none of it felt supernatural. Frustrating maybe, unsettling at times, but explainable. The disturbing incidents began with the children. The Smurl's oldest daughter began waking up terrified during the night. She claimed people were standing inside her bedroom watching her while she slept. Jack repeatedly searched the room and found nothing. But according to the family, the fear in the house slowly deepened over the years. Footsteps echoed upstairs while everyone sat downstairs together. Banging sounds came from inside the walls late at night. Toilets flushed by themselves. Radios turned on unexpectedly at full volume. And eventually, the voices began. According to the Smurl daughters, some of the most disturbing experiences in the house involved hearing family members calling them from isolated parts of the duplex late at night. As the years passed, the Smurl children reportedly became increasingly afraid of certain parts of the duplex, particularly at night. The upstairs hallway, the basement stairs, the rooms furthest away from everyone else. According to the family, the girls began hearing voices calling to them from inside the house after dark. Sometimes the voices sounded exactly like Janet. Soft, patient, calm.
Hey, come here for a second.
Other times the voice sounded like one of their sisters calling from another room. Occasionally, they claimed it sounded like Jack. The voices reportedly always came from somewhere isolated. An empty bedroom, the basement, the far end of the hallway where the lights didn't fully reach. And according to the Smurl daughters, the voices never shouted. They never sounded angry. If anything, they sounded unusually gentle. That was what frightened the family later, because the children often initially believed the voices were real. One of the girls later claimed she heard her mother calling softly from upstairs late one evening.
Can you come here for a minute?
The voice sounded completely normal. The child reportedly began walking toward the hallway before suddenly realizing her mother was downstairs in the kitchen the entire time. Another account described one of the daughters hearing her sister whisper her name repeatedly from inside an empty bedroom. According to the family, when she approached the doorway, the room was dark, silent, empty. The whispering stopped immediately. Janet later claimed the experiences deeply disturbed the children because the voices never sounded threatening enough to ignore. They sounded trustworthy, familiar, like someone they loved wanted their attention. Over time, the family reportedly became convinced that whatever was inside the house understood the routines of the children. It knew their names, it knew their voices, and according to the Smurls, it knew how to imitate both. The Smurl family would later become convinced that whatever was inside the house was deliberately attempting to lure the children into isolated parts of the home away from others. That detail deeply unsettled Janet and Jack, because if the voices had sounded monstrous, the children might have ignored them, but they didn't. They sounded safe. Over time, according to the family, the entity inside the house began imitating more than voices. It began imitating the family itself. Jack's mother, Mary Smurl, later claimed she repeatedly overheard violent arguments coming through the walls separating the two halves of the duplex. She heard Jack screaming at Janet, furniture moving, profanity. At times, the arguments sounded so intense that Mary feared someone inside the home might be hurt. But whenever she confronted them afterward, Janet and Jack appeared calm. No argument had taken place. Nothing inside the home appeared disturbed. According to the family, this happened multiple times. The Smurls later became convinced the entity was mimicking their voices in order to create fear and tension between family members, almost as though it enjoyed turning them against one another. Then there was the dog. The family owned a German Shepherd named Simon. On several occasions, Jack and Janet reportedly heard Simon howling somewhere else in the house late at night. Not barking or growling, but howling in distress. The kind of sound that immediately forces someone to awaken panic. But according to the family, whenever they rushed to investigate, they found Simon asleep beside their bed, undisturbed and silent. By the mid-1980s, the Smurls claimed the activity inside the duplex had escalated dramatically. Janet later reported seeing a black humanoid figure standing inside the kitchen during broad daylight. She described it as human-shaped but made from shifting darkness. Not solid, not transparent, something in between. The figure reportedly moved silently through the room before vanishing. Strangely, Mary Smurl later claimed she had seen a similar black figure independently on the opposite side of the duplex. The descriptions closely matched: a tall, dark shape moving silently through the home, watching, appearing briefly, then disappearing. Around this same time, the family reported a foul odor repeatedly appearing throughout the house. Rotting sewage, decay. The smell often appeared suddenly and vanished just as quickly. Skeptics would later argue the odor may have been connected to sewer problems in the area, but according to the Smurls, the smell often accompanied other activity inside the house. Knocking, voices, apparitions, as though the odor itself announced the presence of something nearby. One of the most publicized incidents reportedly occurred in 1985. Janet and her daughter were inside the kitchen when a heavy ceiling light fixture suddenly tore free and crashed onto the table beneath them without warning. The family later claimed the damage appeared unnatural, almost as though the fixture had been violently ripped downward. Fortunately, nobody was seriously injured. But according to the Smurls, fear inside the duplex was becoming constant. The family reportedly slept poorly. The children became increasingly afraid of certain rooms. And according to Jack and Janet, the house itself no longer felt random. It felt aware. The voices reportedly appeared most often when someone was isolated. In the basement, in the bathroom, inside bedrooms late at night. Janet later claimed the voice in the basement incident never answered direct questions. It only repeated her name, again and again, as though the goal was not communication, but recognition, as though something inside the house wanted acknowledgement, wanted someone to answer back. By 1986, the Smurl family contacted paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren. The Warrens were already nationally famous due to their involvement in other haunting cases, including the Amityville investigation. According to the Warrens, the Smurl duplex contained multiple spirits as well as an inhuman demonic presence feeding on fear inside the home. The Warrens later claimed to have gathered disturbing audio recordings from inside the duplex, including whispering voices, knocking sound, and unexplained disturbances. Ed Warren specifically argued that the entity inside the house used mimicry and psychological manipulation to terrorize the family. Critics strongly disputed these claims. Skeptics, including investigators and psychologists, later argued the events could potentially be explained through stress, suggestion, neurological issues, environmental factors, or outright fabrication. Some critics also argued the Warrens themselves may have intensified the family's interpretation of ordinary events by framing them as demonic attacks. But regardless of the explanation, the fear inside the house became very real for the Smurls. The case soon attracted national media attention. Reporters crowded outside the duplex. Neighbors claimed to hear screaming coming from the property at night. Some allegedly reported hearing disturbances even when the family was away from the home entirely. One particularly disturbing account involved a neighbor reportedly calling the Smurl residence while the family was out of town. According to the story, a young girl answered the phone, laughing softly before abruptly disconnecting the call. no child was supposed to be inside the house. As media attention intensified, the Smurls claimed the activity worsened. Voices, banging, apparitions, whispers from empty rooms. The children continued reporting hearing family members calling to them from isolated parts of the house late at night. And according to the Smurls, the voices always sounded convincing. That was what terrified them the most in the end. Not the shadows, not the smells, not even the apparitions. It was the feeling that something inside the house understood exactly how human beings sounded, exactly how trust worked, exactly how to make someone follow a familiar voice into the dark. Over time, priests blessed the home multiple times. Religious groups gathered there to pray. Eventually, the Smurl family moved away from the duplex entirely. Later residents reportedly claimed they experienced nothing unusual inside the property. And to this day, the Smurl haunting remains deeply controversial. Some believe the family genuinely experienced something terrifying inside the Chase Street duplex. Others believe fear, stress, suggestion, religious belief, environmental conditions, and media pressure created a powerful form of shared psychological reinforcement within the household. But whether the events were supernatural or not, one detail from the case continues to deeply disturb people decades later. According to the Smurl children, the voices never sounded threatening. They sounded familiar. And sometimes, the children almost followed them. If you enjoyed this, you can like the video and subscribe for more. Feel free to leave a comment. It helps more than you know. In the town of Atchison, there's a narrow brick house sitting quietly along a residential street that over the last several decades became one of the most talked about paranormal locations in America. At first glance, the house does not stand out. It looks like many older homes throughout the Midwest. A modest two-story structure in a quiet neighborhood. Cars passing by during the day, porch lights glowing at night, children riding bicycles through nearby streets. But inside the house, former residents, paranormal investigators, and overnight visitors have described experiences ranging from subtle disturbances to violent physical encounters. And unlike many famous hauntings built around a single dramatic story, the Sally House legend evolves slowly over time. Through witness testimony, television appearances, paranormal investigations, and decades of people attempting to explain experiences they believe they had inside the home. The house itself dates back to the mid-1800s and is historically associated with Dr. Charles Finney and the Finney family. According to local legend, a young girl named Sally was brought to the home suffering from severe abdominal pain. The story claims Dr. Finney attempted emergency surgery before anesthesia had fully taken effect. According to the legend, the girl awoke screaming during the operation and later died from blood loss. Believers would eventually claim her spirit remained inside the home. But despite how widely repeated the story became, there is no verified historical evidence proving a girl named Sally ever lived or died there. Researchers have never confirmed the story through medical records, death certificates, or historical documentation. Some skeptics have even argued the legend may have gradually developed through local folklore and tourism promotion as Atchison embraced a reputation as one of the most haunted towns in Kansas. Still, stories surrounding the house continued spreading, and by the early 1990s, the Sally House would become nationally known. In 1993, Tony and Deborah Pickman moved into the home shortly after getting married. At the time, they were focused on ordinary things: work, family life, raising their infant son. According to later interviews, neither of them initially expected anything unusual about the house. But not long after moving in, Deborah began noticing small disturbances centered around the upstairs nursery. She later described putting the baby down for naps, leaving the room, and returning to find toys moved into different positions than where she remembered leaving them. At first, the incident seemed minor. A stuffed animal turned another direction, toys repositioned across the room, objects gathered together differently than before. Individually, none of it seemed dramatic enough to immediately suggest something paranormal. The couple reportedly tried to explain the activity logically: exhaustion from caring for a newborn, forgetfulness, misremembering where things had been placed, an old house settling and making noise. But according to the Pickmans, the incidents continued happening while no one else had been upstairs. Deborah also described hearing sounds coming from the nursery while the room was empty. At times, she reportedly heard footsteps overhead while downstairs with the baby. And gradually, the couple began describing something harder to explain than moved objects. The atmosphere inside the house itself, especially upstairs. According to later interviews, certain rooms began feeling emotionally heavy. Not necessarily frightening at first, just uncomfortable. The kind of feeling witnesses later struggled to clearly describe. Several years later, investigators and visitors would report similar experiences inside the home. A sense of tension, uneasiness, the feeling that the mood inside the house changed depending on where you stood. As time passed, however, the claims reportedly became more aggressive. And according to Tony Pickman, the activity eventually became physical. Tony later claimed he was shoved unexpectedly inside the home on multiple occasions. At times, he alleged he was pinned down by an unseen force. He also described incidents where he felt pressure around his throat or chest while alone inside the house. According to later interviews and paranormal documentaries, many of the most disturbing incidents allegedly occurred near the basement and lower level of the home. The basement itself would eventually become one of the most discussed parts of the Sally House legend. According to paranormal investigators and later visitors, the area reportedly felt different from the rest of the house. Heavier, more oppressive. Some claim they experienced nausea, anxiety, dizziness, or sudden emotional changes while standing there. But the most widely discussed incidents involve scratches appearing across Tony's body. Photographs taken during the period show long cuts and marks across the torso that the Pickmans claimed appeared suddenly and without explanation. Some of the scratches were relatively minor, others appeared significantly deeper. According to reports, several wounds were severe enough that medical attention was allegedly sought. These incidents became central to the national reputation of the Sallie House and were heavily featured in paranormal television coverage throughout the following years. Believers connected the attacks directly to the legends surrounding Sallie. Over time, the alleged entity associated with the home became publicly known as, quote, the man-hating ghost, unquote. The theory centered around the story of the failed surgery involving Dr. Finney. If the child spirit blamed a male doctor for her death, believers argued that hostility may have transferred toward men entering the house. Skeptics strongly disputed those interpretations. Critics argued the scratches could have resulted from accidental injury, stress-related behavior, psychosomatic reactions, or self-inflicted wounds intensified by fear and suggestion inside an emotionally charged environment. But according to the Pickmans, the emotional atmosphere inside the home continued deteriorating. Tony reportedly became increasingly angry, withdrawn, and emotionally volatile while living there. Sleep became difficult. Arguments increased. The stress inside the home reportedly intensified over time. And according to later accounts, the fear eventually stopped revolving around unexplained noises or moved toys. It became the feeling that whatever was inside the house was escalating. As stories about the home spread locally, paranormal investigators eventually began visiting the property. Then came national television exposure. In the 1990s, the case appeared on Sightings, introducing the Sallie House story to a national audience. The program focused heavily on the Pickmans' experiences, especially the alleged physical attacks involving Tony. And once the case entered television culture, the mythology surrounding the house expanded rapidly. Over the following years, the Sallie House appeared on programs including A Haunting, Paranormal Witness, Ghost Adventures, and later, BuzzFeed Unsolved Supernatural. With every investigation and television appearance, the theories surrounding the house became darker. What had originally been framed primarily as the spirit of a young girl gradually evolved into claims involving multiple entities and possible demonic influence. One detail frequently discussed by paranormal investigators involved a stain in the basement that some believe resembled the shape of a pentagram. Over time, speculation surrounding the marking contributed to theories that the house may have contained something beyond the original Sallie legend. Some investigators began suggesting the alleged child spirit could have been masking a more hostile presence altogether. Others believed the pentagram narrative itself may have evolved naturally through repeated paranormal retellings, internet discussion, and media amplification over time. Additional claims also emerged involving unexplained fires reportedly occurring during the Pickmans' residency. According to accounts surrounding the case, small fires allegedly broke out inside the home on multiple occasions, further contributing to the belief among investigators that the activity inside the house had become increasingly destructive. Modern paranormal investigations inside the Sallie House often involve infrared cameras, EVP sessions, REM pods, motion sensors, and overnight surveillance equipment. Investigators have reported hearing footsteps moving through empty rooms, whispers in hallways, snapping sounds, and voices allegedly captured during recording sessions. Some described hearing movement upstairs while no one else was on the second floor. One investigative group later claimed they asked how many entities were present inside the home. According to their interpretation of the recording, the response sounded like, quote, "several of us," unquote. Moments like that helped reinforce the belief among paranormal investigators that the phenomena associated with the house extended beyond the original child ghost legend. At the same time, skepticism surrounding the Sally house also continued growing. Critics pointed out that paranormal investigations are highly susceptible to suggestion and confirmation bias. Audio recordings can be misinterpreted. Environmental sounds can gain meaning after repeated listening. And once a location develops a reputation as haunted, expectation alone can strongly influence how ordinary experiences are perceived. That tension between belief and skepticism eventually became the part of the Sally House story itself. Because by the 2000s, the property was no longer simply a private residence connected to local rumors. It had become part of the identity of Atchison. Ghost tours began operating throughout the city. Visitors traveled specifically to investigate the Sally House overnight. The property transformed from a family home into a permanent fixture of American paranormal culture. At one point, the house was even publicly listed for sale. According to reports, the property appeared on Zillow in 2016 with an asking price of $1 million before later dropping significantly in price and eventually being removed from the market. Today, the Sally House remains active as a paranormal attraction. Investigators still spend nights there hoping to document evidence of something unexplained. Some leave convinced the house is genuinely haunted. Others leave believing the atmosphere, expectation, and decades of mythology surrounding the location are enough to explain many of the reported experiences. And in many ways, that uncertainty may be the reason the story continues to survive. Because unlike many haunting legends built entirely on folklore, the Sally House evolved publicly through interviews, television footage, photographs, investigator reports, internet discussion, and ordinary people attempting to understand experiences they believe they could not explain. Even now, decades after the Pickmans first moved into the house, there is still no definitive answer for what actually happened there. No confirmed evidence proving Sally existed. No verified documentation proving the surgery story occurred. No universally accepted explanation for the scratches, the voices, the basement experiences, or the emotional deterioration described by former residents. Just a quiet brick house in Kansas, and decades of people walking through the same rooms and describing remarkably similar feelings once they stepped inside. If you enjoyed this, you can like the video and subscribe for more. Feel free to leave a comment. It helps more than you know. In 1988, a 23-year-old single mother named Jackie Hernandez moved into a small rented bungalow on West 11th Street in San Pedro, California, hoping it would serve as a fresh start during one of the most difficult periods of her life. At the time, Jackie was pregnant, working multiple jobs, attending school part-time, and going through a stressful divorce. Financially, her options were limited. The house she rented wasn't ideal, but it was affordable, and more importantly, it was available. The neighborhood itself was quiet. a working-class area with modest homes and little reason to draw attention. The bungalow looked like any other house on the street. Single story, simple layout, small yard, and an attic space above the kitchen. For Jackie, it wasn't about comfort, it was about stability. For the first time, everything seemed normal. Then, small things began to happen. Objects would go missing and later reappear in different locations. Items she was certain she had just set down would no longer be where she left them. Occasionally, she would hear faint knocking sounds, subtle at first, like something tapping from inside the walls. There were also smells. Not constant, but intermittent. A sour, unpleasant odor that would drift through certain rooms and then disappear just as quickly. At times, it seemed strongest near the kitchen, though there was never an obvious source. Given the stress she was under, Jackie initially dismissed these experiences. Lack of sleep, emotional strain, and the demands of daily life provided a reasonable explanation. But over time, the frequency increased. The noises became more distinct, the misplaced objects became harder to rationalize, and the overall feeling inside the house began to change. Jackie later described it as a constant awareness that she wasn't alone. Not in a vague sense, but something more immediate, as if something was always just behind her, watching. The moment that changed everything came one evening while she was sitting in her living room. From where she was sitting, she could partially see into the hallway. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed movement. A pencil holder sitting on a table had lifted into the air. It didn't tip over or slide. It lifted. For a brief moment, it hovered. Then it moved, fast. The object shot down the hallway toward her with enough force to make it clear this wasn't accidental. Startled, Jackie grabbed her son and ran out of the house. She went to a neighbor's home and called the police, hoping for some kind of explanation. When the officers arrived, they found nothing unusual. No signs of forced entry, no damage that couldn't be explained. To them, it was a misunderstanding. But for Jackie, it marked a clear shift. Something inside that house had just acted with intent. In the days that followed, others began to experience similar events. Her neighbor, Susan Castaneda, later described hearing a loud crash in another room while visiting. When they went to investigate, they found that a painting had fallen, but not beneath where it had been hanging. It had landed several feet away, as if it had been thrown. On another occasion, Susan reported seeing a lamp move across a room before dropping. It didn't tip over or fall down, it was moving. At that point, the activity could no longer be explained as stress or imagination. Multiple people were witnessing the same thing. Over time, the activity escalated. After the birth of her second child, the situation intensified significantly. What had once been minor disturbances became more aggressive and unpredictable. One night, Jackie noticed a dark liquid seeping from the ceiling and running down the walls of her kitchen. The substance was thick, heavy, and deep in color. It resembled blood. Concerned about a leak, she climbed onto a washing machine to reach the attic hatch. The opening was small, forcing her to lift herself carefully to look inside. As she pushed the hatch open and looked into the darkness, her eyes adjusted just enough to make out shapes. That's when she saw it. A human head, floating in the corner of the attic, detached, motionless at first, staring directly at her. Within seconds, it moved rapidly toward her. Startled, Jackie fell backward into the kitchen, hitting the floor and breaking down in panic. She refused to enter the attic again, but whatever she had seen did not remain confined to that space. Not long after, she reported seeing a full figure inside her children's room. She described an elderly man with gray, sunken skin, wearing a red flannel vest. The figure was sitting on a bed, watching her. The detail that stood out most to her was the eyes. Red, focused. Moments later, the figure disappeared. At that point, Jackie sought outside help. She contacted Barry Taff, a parapsychologist known for investigating thousands of reported hauntings over the course of his career. Taff agreed to visit the home with his team. When they arrived, they immediately noticed a strong, unpleasant odor throughout the house. It seemed to be coming from the attic. They also reported hearing heavy movement above them, not faint noises, distinct sounds as if something large was moving through the space. 2 members of the team entered the attic to investigate. Inside, visibility was extremely limited. Using a camera flash to briefly illuminate the area, they attempted to document what they were experiencing. During this process, one of them reported that the camera was suddenly pulled from his hands and thrown across the attic. The force was strong enough to separate parts of the equipment. They exited shortly afterward. The situation continued to escalate. Jackie later reported that objects were being thrown throughout the house, aggressively. She also described being physically attacked, grabbed and restrained by something she couldn't see. In one incident, she claimed she was held down and unable to breathe. When Taff's team returned, they again entered the attic. During this visit, one of the investigators suddenly began shouting. A cord had wrapped tightly around his neck, pinning him against a wooden beam. Although he remained conscious, he required assistance to free himself. No one present could explain how the cord had moved or tightened. Following this incident, the team ended their investigation at the property. Shortly afterward, Jackie made the decision to leave. She relocated hundreds of miles north, hoping distance would put an end to the events. For a brief time it did. The activity stopped. The house was gone. The experiences faded. Then they returned. Months later, Jackie began reporting similar occurrences in her new home. Scratching sounds, unexplained movement, lights appearing without a clear source. In one incident, her daughter's bed caught fire after Jackie reported seeing a dark mist moving through the hallway. Neighbors in the area also claimed to witness unusual events, including reflections of a man's face appearing in unexpected places. At that point, it became difficult to argue that the phenomenon was tied to a single location. It appeared to be following her. When Jackie first contacted Barry Taff, this wasn't the first time he had seen a case like this. Years earlier, he had investigated the Doris Bither case, another California case involving a single mother who claimed her home was being overtaken by an unseen force. Like Jackie, Doris Bither reported objects moving, unexplained noises, and physical attacks. Investigators documented strange activity inside the home, including objects reportedly moving on their own and unexplained light phenomena appearing in multiple rooms. As with the San Pedro case, the evidence was inconsistent. Photographs failed to clearly capture what witnesses claimed to see, and much of the documentation relied on personal testimony. But there was another similarity that stood out. Doris, like Jackie, was under extreme personal stress. Her life was unstable, and the activity escalated during that period. Over time, Taft began to notice a pattern. Many of the most intense cases he investigated didn't center around locations. They centered around individuals. Specifically, individuals experiencing high levels of emotional or psychological strain. Some researchers have suggested that in certain cases, poltergeist activity may not originate from an external entity at all. Instead, it may be produced by the individual experiencing it. Not intentionally, not consciously, but as a form of psychological release that manifests physically. If that theory holds any truth, it changes how cases like this are understood, because it would mean the source of the disturbance wasn't the house. It was something connected to the person living inside it. Eventually, Jackie moved again, and this time, the activity stopped completely. To this day, the events surrounding the San Pedro house remain heavily debated. Some believe the case represents the most extreme examples of poltergeist activity ever reported. Others point to the lack of definitive physical evidence, inconsistencies in the timeline, and the absence of clear documentation as reasons to question its validity. But regardless of where the truth lies, one detail stands out. The activity began during one of the most unstable periods of Jackie's life, and as her circumstances improved, it disappeared. Which raises a question that has yet to be answered. Was something haunting that house? Or was something being created within it? If you enjoyed this, you can like the video and subscribe for more. Feel free to leave a comment. It helps more than you know. Now, let's get into it. In 1974, a woman named Doris Bither was living with her children in a small, rundown house on Braddock Street in Culver City, California. The home itself was in poor condition, reportedly condemned by the city more than once, yet it was still being occupied. It wasn't a place most people would choose to live, but for Doris, it was what she could afford. At the time, she was raising multiple children on her own while dealing with financial hardship, and a life that had already been shaped by long-term stress and personal instability. Everything about her situation suggested pressure, and that pressure would later become a key part of how her story was interpreted. What began happening inside that house would eventually become one of the most debated paranormal cases ever recorded. The earliest disturbances were relatively subtle. Doris described objects shifting out of place, doors opening and closing without explanation, and occasional glimpses of human-like shapes that seemed to disappear the moment she tried to focus on them. These figures weren't described as solid, but more like outlines, present enough to notice, but not fully there. At first, the events were unsettling but still easy to dismiss or rationalize. Over time, that changed. According to Doris, the activity became more focused and deliberate, gradually shifting from environmental disturbances to something that felt targeted. She claimed that whatever was inside the house was interacting with her directly. In multiple accounts, she described being physically restrained while lying in bed, unable to move her arms or legs as if they were being held in place. She spoke about pressure against her body and the sensation of being pinned down. She believed there were multiple presences involved, two smaller figures and a third that seemed larger and more dominant, These claims would later become the most disturbing part of the case, and also the most controversial, drawing both intense belief and strong skepticism. The case might have remained unknown if not for a chance encounter. In August of 1974, a man named Cary Gaynor was in a bookstore near UCLA discussing his work as a volunteer in a parapsychology lab. The lab, led by Dr. Thelma Moss, was focused on studying unusual phenomenon using a more structured, research-based approach. As Gaynor spoke, Doris approached him and introduced herself. She told him her house was haunted and that the activity had become violent. Gaynor took her information and brought it back to the lab, where he worked with researcher Barry Taff. After hearing the details, Taff agreed to visit the home. When they arrived, their initial reaction was not what Doris had hoped for. The house was in severe disrepair, and the overall environment raised immediate concerns. After listening to her describe the events, especially the more extreme claims, Taff's first impression was that she might be dealing with a psychological issue rather than a paranormal one. They spoke with her briefly, asked questions, and ultimately decided not to pursue the case further at that time. Instead, they recommended that she seek professional help and left the property. About 10 days later, Doris reached out again. This time, her story had changed in a way that was harder to dismiss. She reported that neighbors had begun experiencing similar disturbances in their own homes, strange noises, unexplained movement, and events they couldn't account for. This detail shifted the situation. If the activity was no longer isolated to Doris alone, it suggested something broader might be happening. That was enough to bring the investigators back for a second visit. When they returned, they immediately noticed something unusual that hadn't stood out before. There was a smell in the house that seemed to come and go without warning. When it appeared, it was strong and unmistakable, similar to the odor of something decomposing. The investigators searched for a source, checking under the house, inside the walls, and through the plumbing, but nothing explained it. The smell would simply appear, linger briefly, and then disappear again. It was the middle of summer in California, and the house had no air conditioning. The inside felt hot, heavy, and stagnant. But when Doris led them into her bedroom, the temperature changed instantly. The room felt cold, far colder than it should have been compared to the rest of the house. There was no visible explanation for it. Barry Taff would later describe the sensation as stepping into a completely different environment. According to Doris, this room was where most of the activity occurred, and standing there, the investigators began to reconsider their earlier assumptions. Only a short time later, they witnessed something they could not easily explain. A cabinet door opened on its own, and a frying pan moved out of the cupboard and through the air before hitting the floor. There was no one else in the room and no clear cause. That moment marked the beginning of a full investigation that would continue for several weeks and involve a large number of observers, including students, researchers, and photographers. During that time, the house was rarely empty. At times, more than 20 people were present, attempting to observe and document whatever was happening. Reports continued of objects moving, doors shifting, and sounds echoing through the home. But the most unusual phenomenon described by multiple witnesses involved small, glowing lights. These lights were often described as yellow-green orbs that moved through the rooms in unpredictable ways. They didn't behave like reflections or outside light sources. Instead, they appeared to move with direction, changing speed and path, without any clear pattern. In some cases, investigators believed the lights reacted to people in the room. On one occasion, A researcher spoke aloud and asked the light to move away from the wall, and it appeared to change direction and reposition itself in response. While this was not considered definitive proof of anything, it added to the growing sense that the activity was not random. Attempts were made to photograph the phenomenon, but the results were inconsistent. Instead of capturing clear images, the photographs often showed streaks or arcs of light, which skeptics later attributed to camera exposure issues or movement during the shot. Even so, the people present insisted that what they saw in person did not match what appeared on film. One of the most widely reported moments of the investigation involved the lights gathering together in one area of the room. Multiple witnesses claimed that instead of scattering, the lights seemed to merge, forming the outline of a larger shape. According to those accounts, the shape resembled the upper portion of a human figure. It was described as incomplete and short-lived, appearing briefly before disappearing again. As with many other events in the case, no clear photographic evidence captured what witnesses claimed to have seen. In another incident, Doris indicated that an unseen presence was in the room even though no one else could see it. Investigators attempted to document it using a Polaroid camera. Several photos taken during that moment came out heavily overexposed, showing little to no detail. However, when additional photos were taken moments later after she said the presence was gone, they appeared normal. While this inconsistency raised questions, it did not provide a clear answer. As the investigation continued, a pattern began to emerge. The intensity of the activity appeared to fluctuate, often increasing during periods of emotional stress and decreasing when conditions were calmer. This observation led Barry Taft to consider an alternative explanation. Rather than a traditional haunting, he began to explore the possibility that the events could be the result of psychokinetic activity, something being generated unconsciously by Doris herself. Eventually, Doris moved out of the house. For a short period, the activity seemed to stop, but according to reports, it began again after she relocated. Neighbors in the new area described similar disturbances, even though they were unaware of her past experiences. The investigators visited again and documented additional unexplained events, including objects moving and unusual sounds captured on audio recordings. In one instance, a vase was reportedly thrown across a room during a recording session. When the audio was reviewed later, it appeared to include the sound of footsteps approaching the recording device before abruptly cutting off. As with other elements of the case, the recording raised more questions than answers. Over time, the activity gradually faded. Doris moved again, and eventually the reports stopped altogether. What remained was a case filled with conflicting interpretations. Some believed it represented a genuine paranormal event, supported by the number of witnesses who claimed to have seen unusual phenomena firsthand. Others argued that the case could be explained by psychological factors, environmental conditions, and limitations in how the investigation was conducted. The story would later gain widespread attention after inspiring the book and film The Entity, though those versions took significant creative liberties. Separating documented events from dramatized storytelling became increasingly difficult as the case grew more well-known. To this day, there is no single explanation that accounts for everything that was reported. Whether the events were the result of something external, something psychological, or a combination of both remains uncertain. What is clear is that those involved believe they experienced something real, something they could not fully explain, and that uncertainty is what continues to make the case so unsettling. If you enjoyed this, you can like the video and subscribe for more. Feel free to leave a comment. It helps more than you know. In the early 1800s, Tennessee was still considered frontier land. Much of the region was isolated. Dense woods stretched for miles between settlements, roads were rough, and most families lived far enough apart that help could take hours to reach. Life centered around farming, church gatherings, and survival. News traveled slowly, stories traveled faster. It was in this environment near what is now the town of Adams, Tennessee, that one of America's oldest and most enduring paranormal legends began. The story would eventually become known simply as the Bell Witch. What makes the Bell Witch case unusual is not just the paranormal claims themselves, but the way the story evolved over time. Some parts are grounded in real people, real locations, and surviving historical records. Other details emerged decades later through folklore, oral retellings, and published accounts that historians still debate today. And because of that, the Bell Witch exists in a strange place between documented history and American mythology. The Bell family arrived in the Red River settlement area of Tennessee in the early 1800s. The family patriarch, John Bell, was considered successful by frontier standards. He owned farmland, livestock, and had established himself within the community. By most accounts, the Bells were respected and relatively stable compared to many families living in the region at that time. For years, life appears to have been ordinary, but according to later accounts, that changed sometime around 1817. The earliest stories describe John Bell encountering something strange in a cornfield on his property. Different versions describe it differently. Some say it resembled a large black dog. Others describe a creature with the body of a dog and the head of a rabbit. In several retellings, Bell reportedly fired at the animal after it refused to flee, but the creature disappeared into the woods. There is no contemporary documentation confirming the encounter. The story comes from later retellings, particularly accounts compiled decades afterward. But in nearly every version of the Bell Witch legend, this moment is treated as the beginning. At first, the disturbances inside the Bell home were subtle. The family reportedly began hearing scratching sounds against the walls of the cabin at night. Then came knocking sounds, chains dragging across the floor, heavy breathing noises, tapping against windows. At first, the family apparently tried to explain the sounds naturally. Animals inside the walls would not have been uncommon on the Tennessee frontier. Cabins shifted and creaked constantly. Wind moved through loose boards. But according to the family's later testimony, the sounds continued to intensify. Eventually, they claimed the noises became impossible to ignore. The sounds were no longer confined to one area of the house. They moved from room to room. At night, bed sheets were allegedly pulled from sleeping family members. Pounding sounds echoed through the cabin walls. In some accounts, the family described hearing chains dragging across wooden floors even when nobody was awake. One of the most disturbing elements of the story involved John Bell's daughter, Betsy Bell. According to later reports, Betsy became the primary target of the disturbances. The family claimed she was slapped, pinched, scratched, and physically assaulted by an unseen force. Witnesses allegedly observed bruises and marks appearing on her body. Again, it is important to separate verified history from folklore here. Most of the detailed descriptions associated with the Bell Witch haunting were published decades after the alleged events. The most influential source was an 1894 book titled An Authenticated History of the Famous Bell Witch, written by Martin V. Ingram. Ingram claimed to base much of his material on earlier manuscripts and witness recollections, but historians have long questioned how much of the story was embellished over time. Still, even with skepticism surrounding the details, the Bell Witch legend spread rapidly throughout Tennessee and beyond. According to the accounts, the disturbances escalated far beyond simple noises. At some point, the entity allegedly began speaking. The Bell family claimed the voice could carry on conversations, quote scripture, sing hymns, and reveal private information about visitors. In some stories, the entity identified itself as Kate. Over time, people in the area began associating the alleged spirit with a local woman named Kate Batts. Batts reportedly had previous disagreements with John Bell involving land and business dealings. Some versions of the story claim she placed a curse on the Bell family before her death. Other historians argue that this connection was exaggerated later as the story evolved. What is known is that the Bell Witch legend gradually became tied to her name, eventually leading many to refer to the entity itself simply as Kate. As stories spread through the surrounding communities, visitors allegedly began arriving at the Bell property hoping to witness the disturbances for themselves. And according to later accounts, many claim they did. Some visitors reportedly described hearing the voice speak directly to them. Others claimed to witness furniture moving or unexplained sounds inside the house. Several accounts describe the entity insulting visitors, mocking them, or exposing personal secrets they believed nobody else could have known. But like much of the Bell Witch story, these reports are difficult to independently verify. Most survive only through secondhand retellings, oral tradition, or publications written decades after the fact. Still, by the early 1800s, the Bell Witch had already become a regional phenomenon. And then came the story that would permanently cement the legend into American folklore. The illness and death of John Bell. According to historical records, John Bell did become seriously ill near the end of his life. Contemporary records confirm that he died in December of 1820. The paranormal claims surrounding his death, however, come from later accounts. According to the legend, Bell's condition worsened over time. He reportedly experienced episodes of facial paralysis, difficulty swallowing, and periods where he could barely speak. Then, shortly before his death, family members allegedly discovered a small vial of liquid near his bed. According to the story, the entity claimed responsibility. Some versions state the spirit declared it had poisoned John Bell and then forced the liquid down the throat of a cat to demonstrate its lethality. The cat reportedly died shortly afterward. There is no verified evidence supporting these claims. No autopsy was performed, and historians generally view the poisoning story as folklore rather than documented fact. But within the legend itself, John Bell's death became the central event around which everything else revolved. According to many retellings, the disturbances largely subsided afterward. Not completely, but enough that later storytellers framed John Bell as the primary target of the haunting from the very beginning. One of the most famous and controversial parts of the Bell Witch legend involves Andrew Jackson. According to folklore, Jackson visited the Bell property before becoming president after hearing stories about the haunting. The story claims his wagon became mysteriously stuck near the property and would not move until an unseen voice allowed it to proceed. Later that night, according to the tale, unseen forces allegedly attacked members of Jackson's group. The future president supposedly declared he would rather fight the British again than deal with the Bell Witch. It is a compelling story. There is also little historical evidence that it actually happened. Most historians believe the Andrew Jackson account was likely added later as the legend expanded. And that uncertainty is part of what makes the Bell Witch so fascinating historically. Because over time, the haunting stopped being just a local ghost story. It became folklore. The Bell Witch spread through newspapers, books, campfire stories, stage productions, paranormal literature, and eventually television documentaries. With each generation, new details appeared while older versions shifted or disappeared. And over the years, another location became closely tied to the legend: the Bell Witch Cave. Today, the cave and surrounding property near Adams, Tennessee operate as a tourist destination focused on the Bell Witch legend. Visitors can tour the cave, explore reconstructed historical buildings, and participate in paranormal investigations. But interestingly, historians point out that the cave itself was not heavily emphasized in the earliest version of the Bell Witch story. Many of the cave-related paranormal claims appear to have developed later as the legend evolved. That evolution tells us something important. The Bell Witch was never a static story. It changed over time. It absorbed new details, new interpretations, and new fears depending on the generation retelling it. And because of that, separating fact from folklore becomes increasingly difficult. What remains undeniable is that the Bell Witch became one of the most influential supernatural legends in American history. Even today, more than 200 years later, people still debate what really happened on the Bell property. Skeptics point to folklore development, religious hysteria, interpersonal conflict, exaggeration, and the unreliability of oral tradition. Others believe something genuinely unexplained occurred inside that Tennessee farmhouse. And perhaps the reason the Bell Witch continues to endure is because it exists in that uncertain space between the two. Not fully history, not fully myth, but something suspended between them. A story rooted in real people, real land, and real fear. That slowly transformed into one of America's oldest paranormal legends. If you enjoyed this, you can like the video and subscribe for more. Feel free to leave a comment. It helps more than you know. In 1994, a ranching family moved onto a remote 480-acre property in northeastern Utah, believing they had found their forever home. For privacy, they've always been referred to as the Gormans. The family seemed grounded, practical, and stable. The father was a hardened rancher and college-educated businessman. His wife was intelligent, professional, and organized. Their 2 teenage children were strong students with promising futures. On the day they moved in, the rancher's father was also there helping unload. The land itself looked ideal. It was wide, green, and well watered, with pastures, brush, trees, and a creek along one side. On the other side rose a jagged red sandstone ridge, watching over the property like a wall. It should have been the start of a new life. Instead, it became the beginning of a nightmare. While the family was unloading their belongings, they noticed an animal near the tree line. At first, they assumed it was a stray dog, but as it moved closer, they realized it was something much larger. It looked like a wolf. Not just any wolf, but an enormous one. The animal advanced slowly in a zigzag pattern, cautious but deliberate, moving closer and closer to the family. At first, they wondered whether it might be a domesticated wolf or some kind of exotic pet. It wasn't acting like a normal wild predator. It walked right toward them, closing the distance until it was only a few feet away. The air carried the wet, musky scent of a soaked dog. The creature was massive, estimated at close to 200 pounds, with a thick skull, powerful jaws, and a back that reached nearly to the rancher's chest. Then, without warning, it exploded into motion. The wolf lunged toward a nearby corral where Angus calves had been unloaded earlier. One calf had stuck its head through the bars, and the animal clamped down on its skull with terrifying force, dragging it out. The rancher rushed in and began kicking the beast as hard as he could in the ribs. It did nothing. His father struck it repeatedly with a baseball bat. Still nothing. No cry, no stumble, no sign of pain. The rancher then ordered his son to grab a .357 Magnum from the truck. He fired once. No reaction. He fired again. Still nothing. A third shot hit the animal in the side. There was no yelp, no visible wound, no blood, no panic. The thing simply kept pulling at the calf as if the bullets meant nothing. Now desperate, the rancher retrieved a .30-06 hunting rifle. He fired again, and this time the creature released the calf and sat back. Another shot followed, and a chunk of flesh flew off its body. The family could hear the rounds hitting flesh and bone, yet the animal behaved as though it felt almost nothing. Finally, it turned and walked away. Not ran, walked. The rancher and his son followed it into a muddy area near the creek, tracking its heavy prints through the brush. At one point, the paw prints sank deep into the mud, showing just how heavy the animal had been. Then, suddenly, the tracks stopped. No sign of a leap, no trail continuing forward. The prints simply ended, as if the animal had vanished into thin air. When they returned, the piece of flesh that had been shot from the creature smelled rotten, like meat left out in the sun for days. And that was only the first day. Later, when investigators showed the family images of different wolf species, They agreed that the closest match to what they had seen was something resembling a dire wolf. A dire wolf, an animal believed to have gone extinct thousands of years ago. As strange as that sounds, the wolf encounter was only the beginning. The property they had moved on to would later become infamous as Skinwalker Ranch. The ranch sat in Utah's Uinta Basin, a region long associated with bizarre reports, UFO sightings, strange lights, mutilated animals, massive creatures, disembodied voices, and stories passed through both local rumor and native tradition. The basin had a long reputation before the Gormans ever arrived. Residents, law enforcement officers, ranchers, and members of the Ute community had been describing unusual events there for decades. UFO sightings were common enough that many locals treated them as part of life. Cattle mutilations had been reported again and again. Some families spoke about things seen in the sky. Others talked about what moved across the land at night. There were warnings about skinwalkers, malevolent entities tied to cursed traditions, shape-shifting, and spiritual danger. Whether outsiders believed those stories or not, many native residents took them very seriously and avoided the area. The Gormans knew none of this when they bought the ranch. They did, however, notice some unsettling details. Heavy chains had been mounted near the doors, as if huge guard dogs had once been stationed there. Doors and cabinets inside the home were secured with bolts and locks. The former owners had even included a bizarre condition in the sale agreement: no digging on the property without prior approval. At the time, the family dismissed it as eccentric behavior from previous owners. Soon, that explanation stopped working. Objects began disappearing and reappearing in impossible places. A heavy post hole digger vanished from the yard and was later found in a high tree. Groceries brought home from town were unpacked, only to appear back inside their bags minutes later. A towel left beside the shower would turn up in the freezer. A hairbrush would vanish from the bathroom and later be found in the microwave. At first it was annoying, then it became terrifying. The family started hearing footsteps in the hallway at night, but when they checked, no one was there. They saw dark figures near windows and at the foot of the beds. They heard voices speaking in unknown languages, sometimes sounding as though they were hovering just above them. Lights also began appearing around the property. Some nights, the ranch would be flooded with intense illumination from above, as if a spotlight had been turned on from the sky. Other times, beams of light seemed to shoot upward from the ground itself. They heard mechanical noises beneath their feet, like machinery operating underground. And then there were the animals. The first wolf was not the last. Another oversized wolf-like creature approached Ellen Gorman at the gate, so tall its back nearly reached the roofline of her vehicle. At times, these wolves were seen alongside other bizarre canine creatures that didn't resemble anything known in the area. The family also reported strange birds, bright red, tropical-looking birds that did not belong in Utah and were never identified. Then came something even stranger. One afternoon, Tom and Ellen returned from town to find a violent commotion in the corral. Something large was attacking their horses. It looked roughly dog-like, but not entirely. It had the size and muscle of a powerful predator, short, heavy legs, and a long reddish tail like a fox. It clawed at the horses, injuring them badly. Tom ran toward it. The creature fled up a hill and then disappeared. Not into brush, not behind rocks. It simply vanished. By this point, the Gormans were also seeing aerial objects. Some looked like large, boxy vehicles, almost like an RV, except they rose into the air and drifted off. Others resembled discs. Others were triangular. Some projected beams of light across the property. Others appeared as glowing orbs in different colors: white, red, orange, and blue. The family believed these objects were not behaving like aircraft. They moved intelligently. Sometimes they seemed to react to people directly. Even stranger, several witnesses described intense emotional effects when these phenomena appeared. In some cases, people felt an unnatural wave of joy or euphoria. In others, they experienced overwhelming fear far beyond what the moment should have caused. One report described a blue orb hovering close enough for witnesses to see what looked like liquid boiling inside of it. The emotional effect, they said, was immediate and overwhelming, raw terror. The events escalated from unsettling to destructive. The family's pets began reacting to something unseen. Large farm dogs hid for days and refused to come out. Then 6 cats vanished all at once and were never found again. In one of the most disturbing incidents, Tom watched as a glowing blue orb toyed with 3 of his hunting dogs, drawing them toward the tree line. He later heard terrible screams. The next morning, all he found were 3 greasy, burned spots where the dogs seemed to have died or been destroyed. By then, the family was under severe stress. They were losing sleep. The children's grades were slipping. Their emotional state was deteriorating. And then, the cattle losses began. The Gormans were not hobby ranchers. They had invested heavily in expensive, selectively bred livestock. Losing even a few animals could be financially devastating. But they didn't lose just a few. They lost 14. Some of the cattle disappeared without explanation. In one case, tracks in the snow simply ended, with no sign of where the animal had gone. In another, a healthy cow seen moments earlier was found mutilated minutes later, with no blood on the ground and no sign of predators or intruders. One neighboring rancher reported a cow with broken legs that vanished, reappeared, and was later found with all 4 legs broken, as if it had been dropped from a height. Even the family's 4 prized bulls became part of the mystery. After joking that losing those bulls would financially ruin them, Tom and Ellen returned from town to find all 4 gone from the corral. Eventually, they discovered the bulls somehow packed tightly inside a locked metal trailer, crammed together and standing in a dazed trance. No one could explain how they got there. At this stage, Tom began to wonder whether the family was being targeted by some kind of secret military operation or psychological test. Out of options, he went to the press. That decision changed everything. News stories about the ranch eventually reached Robert Bigelow, the Las Vegas businessman who founded the National Institute for Discovery Science, or NIDS. Bigelow bought the property. The family moved out, though Tom remained on the ranch as manager. NIDS then launched a scientific investigation, treating the ranch as a living laboratory. Researchers installed equipment, conducted surveys, interviewed witnesses, studied the land, examined the flora and fauna, and monitored the property with surveillance cameras. They also brought in specialists, law enforcement contacts, veterinarians, and field investigators. Their hope was simple: document the phenomena under controlled conditions. But what they found only deepened the mystery. During the NIDS years, investigators reported lights, UFO-like objects, magnetic anomalies, equipment malfunctions, strange odors, mutilated animals, and sightings of large humanoid or creature-like forms. One especially disturbing event happened in daylight. Tom and Ellen were tagging newborn calves in an open pasture. They moved only a short distance away. Moments later, the mother cow began acting wildly, and when they rushed back, a calf they had just tagged less than an hour earlier had been mutilated. A huge amount of tissue and organs were gone. There was almost no blood. Researchers later examined tissue samples and concluded that different cutting methods appeared to have been used. One broad and forceful, another sharp and precise. No footprints, no signs of struggle, no explanation. In another incident, investigators witnessed what appeared to be a glowing, tunnel-like opening in the night. One observer believed he saw something climbing out of it. Then a large, dark creature emerged, stood upright, and ran toward the hillside before disappearing. Was it an animal? A trick of the light? Something else? No one could say. And that became the central problem of Skinwalker Ranch. Again and again, terrifying things were seen, heard, or experienced. Again and again, hard evidence slipped away. The cameras failed or caught only distant lights. Tracks vanished. Bodies disappeared. Witnesses were credible, but the phenomenon refused to behave in a way that allowed clean scientific proof. Depending on who you ask, Skinwalker Ranch is a case about folklore, fear, UFOs, interdimensional theory, environmental anomalies, or human misinterpretation. But for the family who lived there, it was never an abstract debate. It was a place where objects moved on their own, where voices spoke from the darkness, where predators couldn't be killed, where cattle were mutilated in broad daylight, where glowing objects hovered over fields, and where reality itself seemed unstable. To skeptics, the ranch is a pile of stories with too little proof. To believers, it is one of the most concentrated paranormal hotspots in modern history. Either way, the legend of Skinwalker Ranch was not built from one strange night. It was built piece by piece through fear, through repetition, through witnesses who insisted they saw what they saw, and through a property that seemed to challenge every ordinary explanation placed on it. And for the Gorman family, it all began with a wolf that should not have existed. Welcome to. If you enjoy this, you can like the video and subscribe for more. Feel free to leave a comment. It helps more than you know. Tonight's story takes place in late December of 1980 in Suffolk, England, between two U.S. Air Force bases, RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge, separated by a dense stretch of woodland known as Rendlesham Forest. At the time, both bases were active during the Cold War and housed nuclear weapons, which meant security was strict and any unusual activity near the perimeter was taken seriously. What makes this case stand out is not just what was reported, but who reported it. Trained military personnel, security forces, supervisors, and eventually the deputy base commander himself. All describing something that didn't behave the way anything familiar should. Rendlesham Forest sits between the two bases, forming a dark, quiet barrier of trees that becomes almost completely black at night beyond the immediate perimeter lighting. In late December of 1980, that forest became the center of a series of events that would later be referred to as one of the most documented UFO incidents in history. Largely because the accounts came from multiple trained observers over multiple nights, and because parts of the second investigation were recorded in real time. On the first night, shortly after 3 a.m., on December 26, security personnel near the east gate at RAF Woodbridge observed a light descending beyond the tree line. But it didn't move like a meteor, and it didn't behave like an aircraft in distress. Instead, it dropped slowly and appeared to hold position as it moved downward. Described as a red-orange glow surrounded by flashes of blue and white light, pulsing in a steady rhythm, the immediate assumption was that an aircraft had gone down in the forest, so a small team was dispatched to investigate. As they entered the woods, the light remained visible through the trees, but instead of staying fixed, it appeared to shift position slightly as they moved, maintaining distance rather than remaining stationary. At the same time, they reported hearing a high-pitched noise in the distance, while nearby farm animals were reacting loudly, agitated in a way that suggested something had disturbed the area. As the team moved deeper into the forest, the light became clearer and eventually resolved into something physical. One of the men later described a triangular object roughly 9 to 10 feet across and several feet high, positioned low to the ground. Its surface appeared smooth and dark, almost glass-like, but instead of reflecting light normally, it seemed to absorb it. The object emitted a bright white light that illuminated the surrounding area, along with smaller lights along its edges that shifted between red, blue, and white in a repeating pattern. There was no visible propulsion system, no exhaust, and no sound. As he approached, it became clear this wasn't debris or wreckage, it was intact. At one point, he reached out and touched it, later describing the surface as warm and smooth, similar to polished metal or glass, not vibrating or hot, but active in a way that didn't feel inert. While examining it, he noticed geometric symbols arranged with precision along one side. Not random or damaged, but intentionally placed, almost like a form of writing he didn't recognize. Without warning, the object's lights intensified, growing brighter and more defined, and then it began to lift slowly from its position, rising through the trees without making a sound. Within seconds, it accelerated and disappeared completely. At daylight, the area was examined more carefully. Investigators reported 3 depressions in the ground arranged in a triangular pattern, along with broken branches above, suggesting something had interacted physically with the environment. Radiation readings were taken, and while background levels in the surrounding forest were low, slightly higher readings were recorded within the impressions. Not extreme, but enough to be noted and documented. 2 nights later, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt returned to the forest with a team to conduct a more formal investigation. This time, they brought radiation meters, recording equipment, and mobile floodlights they called light-alls. They powered on, but the beams didn't carry through the trees the way they should have, almost as if the light itself was being absorbed or diffused by the environment. Halt recorded the entire investigation on audio tape, and his voice throughout remains calm and methodical, describing positions, distances, and observations as they moved. The team began by examining the landing site again, taking radiation readings at the depressions and surrounding area. Background readings were low, but at the site, the meter produced strong responses. including a noticeable spike that drew attention in real time. As they moved away from the site, they observed a flashing red light in the distance, moving through the trees. It wasn't drifting or flickering randomly, it was advancing, and Halt can be heard stating that it was coming toward them. As the light approached, it became brighter and more defined, at times appearing to break apart into smaller lights before reforming. Through optical equipment, the object appeared to have a dark center surrounded by a glowing outer edge, leading one observer to describe it as resembling an eye, with a bright outer ring and a darker center like a pupil. The light moved laterally, then changed position again, never behaving like a fixed source. At one point during the investigation, the team observed a farmhouse in the distance with what appeared to be a light inside of it. Initially this seemed normal, but then a red-orange light appeared outside the structure, matching the color described in earlier sightings. The light moved toward the farmhouse slowly and deliberately, and just before reaching it, it split into multiple smaller lights, approximately 5 distinct white lights, that separated from the original source and disappeared completely within seconds, with no sound and no gradual fade. Later, multiple lights were observed in the sky, described as star-like objects positioned at a distance. From these lights, narrow beams extended downward toward the ground, not wide or diffused, but focused and concentrated, moving slowly across the forest floor in a way that suggested deliberate scanning. At one point, one of these beams appeared very close to Halt's team, close enough for them to approach the area directly. They moved toward the location where the beam reached the ground and used their radiation equipment to take readings. Once again, the readings were slightly elevated compared to the surrounding environment. Not extreme, but consistent with the earlier site. Halt later described another object positioned above the base itself, emitting similar beams of light downward, expanding the event beyond the forest and suggesting activity over the installation itself. The Rendlesham Forest incident remains one of the most documented and debated UFO cases in history, not because of speculation, but because of the consistency of the accounts. Multiple trained observers, across multiple nights, described something that moved with intention, changed form, emitted controlled light, and left measurable traces in its environment. Not something distant, not something abstract, but something that could be approached, observed, and recorded. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone, leaving behind no confirmed origin, no definitive explanation, and a series of accounts that have remained largely unchanged for decades. Whatever moved through that forest wasn't random, and the people who saw it never described it that way. On the evening of March 13, 1997, thousands of people across the American Southwest reported seeing something in the sky that did not behave like anything they recognized. Not a single light, not a distant aircraft, but a formation large enough to stretch across the horizon, moving slowly, silently, and with a level of control that immediately stood out to those watching it. What makes this case different is not just the number of witnesses, but how consistent their descriptions were across distance, time, and perspective. This is the Phoenix Lights. Let the story unfold. The earliest reports did not begin in Phoenix. They began earlier that evening, just after sunset, near Henderson, Nevada, before continuing southeast toward Arizona. Witnesses in those early locations described a formation of lights arranged in a wide, symmetrical pattern. Some counted 5 lights, others 7, but most agreed on the overall structure, a V-shaped formation, evenly spaced, maintaining fixed positions relative to one another as it moved. It did not blink like conventional aircraft. It did not drift. It moved steadily, deliberately, and without sound. Among those who observed the formation that night was a private pilot flying into Phoenix. He described seeing 6 lights arranged in a V shape, moving steadily across the sky. He reported the sighting to air traffic control, not as something extraordinary, but as a matter of routine. An unidentified set of lights in his flight path. Years later, while watching coverage of the Phoenix lights, he realized that what he had reported that night aligned with the timeline of the event. The pilot was Kurt Russell. At the time, he didn't identify what he saw. He simply reported it. As the formation entered Arizona airspace, reports increased. Residents in towns along its path described stepping outside after noticing something unusual, either alerted by others or drawn by the quiet presence overhead. What stood out was not distance, but proximity. Many witnesses described the formation as low enough to clearly define its shape against the sky. Some reported that as it passed overhead, it appeared to block out the stars behind it, suggesting not just lights, but a solid structure moving between them and the night sky. By the time the formation reached the Phoenix metropolitan area, the number of witnesses had grown significantly. Drivers pulled over. Neighborhoods gathered outside. Entire streets watched as the formation passed overhead. One of the most consistent details across accounts was the silence. No engine noise, no rotor wash, no indication of propulsion. Despite its apparent size, described by some as hundreds of feet across, it moved with no audible presence. What continues to separate this case from many others is the consistency of witness descriptions. People in different locations who did not know each other described a V-shaped formation, evenly spaced lights, slow, steady movement, and in many cases, the impression of a solid object behind the lights. Some witnesses also noted that individual lights appeared to dim or disappear momentarily as the formation passed overhead, as if they were being partially obscured by a larger structure. At the time, there were questions about whether military aircraft could account for the sightings. Luke Air Force Base, located west of Phoenix, conducted routine operations in the area. However, some reports later suggested that pilots in the air that night did not identify any conventional aircraft matching the descriptions being reported from the ground. This didn't confirm anything unusual, but it added contrast. Because if conventional aircraft had been responsible, they would likely have been visible to those already in the air. Later that night, around 10 p.m., a second set of lights appeared over Phoenix. These were different. Rather than moving as a formation, they appeared as a line of bright lights hovering at a distance before slowly fading out one by one. This second event was widely recorded on video and is the footage most often associated with the Phoenix lights today. The U.S. military later stated that the later lights were flares dropped during a training exercise. Flares can appear stationary from a distance. They drift slowly, and they fade sequentially as they burn out. This explanation addressed the second event, but it did not fully account for the earlier reports of a structured formation moving across the state with consistent spacing and no sound. At the time, Arizona's governor publicly downplayed the incident. During a press conference, it was treated humorously, presented as something not to be taken seriously. Years later, however, he would revisit that position. He stated that he had seen something himself that night, something he could not identify, and that his earlier response had been an attempt to prevent public panic. The Phoenix Lights remains one of the most widely witnessed, unexplained aerial events in modern history. Not because of a single photograph, not because of a single account, but because thousands of people across a wide geographic area describe seeing the same thing at roughly the same time, moving in the same direction. A formation of lights, silent, structured, consistent. Some saw only lights, others believed they saw something behind them, but all of them saw something that did not fit easily into a single explanation. Whatever passed over the desert that night was seen by too many people to be dismissed.